There are betrayals that happen in a single moment. A signature on a document, a phone call in the middle of the night, a confession whispered across a dinner table. And then there are betrayals that unfold quietly over years while you're still smiling in family photos, celebrating anniversaries, and believing the person beside you would never be the one to break your heart. For Emily Parker, the betrayal didn't begin on the day she discovered the truth. It began years earlier, hidden inside ordinary conversations, routine business trips, and promises that sounded exactly like love. By the time she uncovered what had really been happening, 24 years of marriage had already been transformed into something she barely recognized. The worst part wasn't losing her husband. It wasn't the lies. It wasn't even the secret he had worked so hard to hide. The worst part was realizing that the person she trusted most in the world had been watching her trust him while knowing he was slowly destroying everything they had built together. On a cold Tuesday morning in January, Emily sat alone in her car outside a bank she had visited countless times before. Her hands trembled as she stared at a stack of documents resting on the passenger seat. A few hours earlier, she had walked into that bank expecting to solve a simple financial issue. Instead, she had discovered something that made her question nearly every memory of her marriage. Years later, when people asked her when everything changed, she didn't mention the arguments or the divorce papers or the courtroom battles that followed. She always pointed to that morning. That was the moment her old life ended. That was the moment she learned that betrayal can wear a familiar face for years without being noticed. And that was the moment a chain of events began that would eventually leave everyone involved facing consequences they never imagined. At first glance, Emily Parker seemed to have the kind of life many people spend decades trying to build. She lived in a comfortable suburb outside Chicago. She had 2 grown children she adored. She had spent most of her adult life supporting her husband's career while managing their home and family. Friends described her as dependable, generous, and endlessly optimistic. If someone had told her years earlier that her marriage would become the center of a devastating deception, she would have laughed at the idea. She believed in loyalty. She believed in commitment. Most importantly, she believed in her husband, Michael Parker. To the outside world, Michael appeared equally devoted. He was successful, respected, and known throughout his industry as a man who could be trusted. Together, they seemed like proof that lasting marriages still existed. But appearances have a way of hiding uncomfortable truths. And sometimes the stories people tell about their lives are very different from the lives they are actually living. The more Emily looked back on those years, the more she realized there had been signs. Small moments that didn't make sense at the time. Strange explanations. Missing details. Tiny inconsistencies she had ignored because trust often convinces us to dismiss the things we don't want to believe. Looking back, those moments formed a trail leading directly toward the truth. The problem was that she didn't know she was supposed to be following it. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The story you're about to hear isn't simply about a marriage falling apart. It isn't only about lies, hidden money, or broken promises. It's about what happens when someone loses almost everything and discovers that survival is only the beginning. Because while betrayal would eventually break Emily in ways she never thought possible, what happened afterward would leave even those closest to her stunned. The question wasn't whether Michael had been keeping secrets. The evidence would eventually answer that. The real question was how long he had been hiding them, who else knew the truth, and why the consequences that followed would completely transform both of their lives. As Emily sat in her car staring at those documents, she had no idea that the answers to those questions were about to change her future forever. To understand how Emily Parker found herself sitting in that parking lot on a freezing January morning, you have to go back more than 2 decades, back to a time when the future seemed simple. Long before the secrets, long before the investigations, and long before she would find herself questioning every chapter of her marriage, Emily was a 26-year-old woman working at a small marketing firm outside Chicago. She was ambitious without being competitive, kind without being naive, and determined to build a stable life after growing up in a household where stability had often been in short supply. Her parents had divorced when she was young, and she spent years watching the emotional and financial damage that followed. Because of that experience, Emily promised herself that when she eventually married, it would be forever, She didn't want temporary relationships. She wanted commitment. She wanted trust. She wanted the kind of partnership that could survive difficult times. Then she met Michael Parker. At the time, Michael was 30 years old and working his way up through a rapidly growing logistics company. He had a confident smile, a calm personality, and a natural ability to make people feel comfortable around him. Friends often described him as reliable. He remembered birthdays, showed up when people needed help, and rarely lost his temper. To Emily, he seemed like everything she had been looking for. Their relationship moved quickly but comfortably. There were no dramatic fights, no major warning signs, and no moments that made her question his intentions. Within 2 years, they were married. Looking back, Emily would later say that she trusted Michael almost immediately because he seemed so different from the people she had known before. He appeared steady, predictable, safe. The first decade of their marriage unfolded much like countless American families. They bought a modest home. They welcomed 2 children. They worked hard, saved money, and slowly improved their financial situation year after year. Michael's career continued to grow, bringing larger paychecks and greater responsibilities. Emily eventually stepped away from full-time work to focus on raising their children and managing the household. It wasn't a decision she made lightly. She had enjoyed her career. But together, she and Michael agreed it made sense for their family. Michael often thanked her for the sacrifices she made. He told friends that he couldn't have achieved his professional success without her support. Every time he said those words, Emily believed him. Years passed. Birthdays came and went. Family vacations filled photo albums. Holidays brought relatives together around crowded tables. Like every marriage, they experienced challenges. There were disagreements about finances, stress from work, concerns about their children's futures, and occasional periods where life felt more routine than exciting. But none of it seemed unusual. In fact, Emily often considered herself fortunate. While friends talked about divorces, affairs, and endless arguments, she felt grateful for what she believed she had. When people asked her the secret to a successful marriage, she always gave the same answer: trust. What Emily didn't realize was that trust can sometimes create its own blind spots. The first signs were so small they barely registered. Michael started traveling more frequently for work. At first, the trips seemed completely reasonable. His company was expanding into new markets, and increased travel appeared to be a natural part of his growing responsibilities. Sometimes he would be gone for 3 days. Other times it would be nearly a week. Emily missed him when he was away, but she understood the demands of his career. The additional income had allowed them to pay for college savings, home improvements, and a comfortable lifestyle. If success required a few extra business trips, it seemed like a fair trade. Still, there were moments that felt slightly unusual. Michael became more protective of his phone than he had been in the past. He occasionally stepped into another room to answer calls. Sometimes he appeared distracted during conversations, as if part of his attention was focused elsewhere. When Emily asked if everything was okay, he always had an explanation ready. Work stress, deadlines, client issues, industry changes. The answers sounded reasonable enough that she never pushed further. After all, everyone goes through stressful periods. Every marriage experiences seasons where one partner seems more distracted than usual. Then there were the financial changes. Because Michael handled most of the household investments, Emily rarely reviewed detailed account information. She knew the basics. Their mortgage was being paid. Retirement accounts were growing. Bills were covered on time. Whenever she asked questions, Michael reassured her that everything was under control. For years, that answer was enough. But as their children entered adulthood and began building lives of their own, Emily started paying closer attention to the family's long-term financial plans. Retirement was no longer a distant concept. It was approaching faster than either of them realized. The first time she asked for a complete overview of their finances, Michael seemed oddly reluctant. He didn't refuse. He simply delayed the conversation. There was always another meeting, another project, another reason to discuss it later. Emily noticed the pattern but chose not to turn it into an argument. She assumed he was busy. What she didn't know was that those delays were buying him time. As the months passed, another change began attracting her attention. Michael's business trips were becoming more frequent, but his stories about them felt less detailed than they once had. Years earlier, he would return home eager to discuss clients, cities, and meetings. Now his descriptions were shorter, more general. If Emily asked specific questions, his answers often seemed rushed. Once or twice, she caught him contradicting something he had said earlier. The inconsistencies were minor, but they lingered in her mind longer than she expected. Then something happened that Emily couldn't quite explain. One evening during a neighborhood gathering, a friend casually mentioned seeing Michael at a restaurant nearly 40 miles from where he claimed to have been attending a business conference. The comment wasn't accusatory. It was made in passing and quickly forgotten by everyone else at the table. But Emily remembered it. She remembered the exact date because Michael had called her from what he described as an industry event taking place in another city that same evening. The discrepancy was small. It could have been an innocent misunderstanding. Yet for the first time in more than 20 years, a question entered her mind that she had never seriously considered before. What if Michael wasn't telling her everything? The thought disturbed her so much that she immediately pushed it away. She felt guilty for even considering it. This was her husband, the father of her children, the man she had trusted for nearly a quarter of a century. Surely there was a logical explanation. But questions have a way of returning when they remain unanswered. And over the next few weeks, Emily would begin noticing things she had overlooked for years. Things that seemed insignificant on their own, but formed a troubling picture when viewed together. A receipt left in a jacket pocket, an unexplained withdrawal, a hotel charge that didn't match a scheduled business trip. A phone call abruptly ended when she entered the room. Individually, none of those details proved anything. Together, they were beginning to tell a story Emily wasn't ready to hear. And the closer she moved toward the truth, the more she would realize that the betrayal waiting ahead was far larger than she had ever imagined. For several weeks, Emily tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. Every time a new question surfaced, she found a reason to dismiss it. That was what people in long marriages often did. They gave each other the benefit of the doubt. They chose trust over suspicion. They looked for explanations instead of accusations. Yet something had changed. Once a crack appears in the image you have of someone, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it. The doubts Emily had spent years ignoring were beginning to gather in one place, and together they were becoming impossible to overlook. The first real shock arrived on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Michael was out of town for what he described as a 3-day conference. Emily was cleaning their home office when she noticed an envelope partially hidden beneath a stack of old paperwork. Normally, she would have ignored it, but something about it caught her attention. The return address belonged to a financial institution she didn't recognize. Curious, she opened it. Inside was an account summary. At first, she assumed it belonged to one of Michael's business accounts. But as she continued reading, confusion quickly turned into concern. The account was registered solely in Michael's name. She had never seen it before. More importantly, the balance was far larger than she expected. Tens of thousands of dollars had moved through the account during the previous year alone. Emily stared at the numbers. Surely there was a reasonable explanation. Perhaps it was connected to an investment. Maybe it was related to a company bonus. Whatever the answer was, she expected Michael would clear everything up when he returned home. But when she called him later that evening, she noticed something unusual. His voice changed the moment she mentioned the account. The calm confidence she had known for years seemed to disappear. He immediately became defensive. "It's nothing," he said. "Just an old account. Nothing important." The explanation felt rushed, incomplete, and for the first time, Emily sensed something she had never heard in her husband's voice before. Fear. That conversation stayed with her throughout the night. The next morning, she woke up determined to put her concerns to rest. If there was an explanation, she wanted to hear it. If there wasn't, she needed to know why. Over the following days, she began quietly gathering information. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just questions. She reviewed old tax documents, retirement statements, bank records, insurance paperwork. What she discovered made her stomach tighten. The secret account wasn't the only one. There were others. Some opened years earlier. Some containing transactions she couldn't explain. Some connected to transfers that appeared to move money away from accounts they shared. The deeper she looked, the more confused she became. The amounts varied. A few thousand here, several thousand there, then larger sums. Money seemed to disappear and reappear in different places. Emily wasn't a financial expert, but she knew enough to recognize that something wasn't right. One evening, she sat alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by paperwork. The same kitchen where birthdays had been celebrated. The same kitchen where she and Michael had planned vacations, discussed their children's futures, and talked about retirement. Now the room felt unfamiliar. She kept asking herself the same question. Why? If Michael had done nothing wrong, why hide any of this? And if he had done something wrong, how long had it been happening? The answers remained out of reach, until a single text message changed everything. It happened entirely by accident. Michael had returned from another business trip and fallen asleep on the living room couch while watching television. His phone rested on the coffee table nearby. Emily wasn't looking for it. She wasn't trying to spy on him. In fact, she was walking past when the screen suddenly illuminated. A message appeared. Just a few words. Simple, casual, yet devastating. Last weekend was amazing. Miss you already. Emily froze. Her heart began pounding. For a moment, she wondered if she had misunderstood. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe it was someone discussing a project. Maybe there was another explanation. But deep down, she already knew. The message wasn't the problem. The problem was everything that had happened before it. The hidden accounts, the strange behavior, the inconsistencies, the secrecy. Suddenly, all of it seemed connected. She stood there staring at the glowing screen until it went dark again. In that moment, 24 years of certainty began collapsing under the weight of a single possibility. The following days were among the longest of her life. She barely slept, barely ate. Every conversation with Michael felt different. Every smile seemed rehearsed. Every explanation sounded calculated. And once suspicion takes root, ordinary moments start looking completely different. Emily found herself replaying years of memories. Business trips, late-night meetings, unexpected schedule changes, moments she had ignored because trust made them seem harmless. Now, they felt like pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed. Yet despite everything, she still hoped she was wrong. She wanted to be wrong. Because if she wasn't, then the life she believed she had spent 24 years building might have been based on a lie. A week later, an opportunity presented itself. Michael left early for work. In his rush to leave, he forgot a leather portfolio he normally carried everywhere. Emily noticed it sitting beside the front door. At first, she intended to call him. Then she hesitated. A strange feeling told her to open it. Inside were meeting notes, travel documents, receipts, nothing unusual, until she reached a folded hotel invoice. The hotel wasn't located anywhere near the city Michael claimed to have visited during one of his recent business trips. What made the discovery even more troubling was the date. Emily remembered that week clearly. Michael had told her he was attending a conference nearly 300 miles away. The hotel receipt proved he had spent at least 2 nights somewhere else entirely. And he hadn't been alone. The invoice listed 2 guests. Emily stared at the paper. The room suddenly felt smaller. The silence felt heavier. For years, she had been searching for reasons to trust. Now evidence was beginning to demand answers. And as painful as the truth already seemed, Emily had no idea that the most devastating discovery was still waiting ahead. Because the hidden money and possible affair were only part of the story. The secret Michael had worked hardest to protect was something far bigger. Something that connected every lie, every missing dollar, every unexplained trip. And when Emily finally uncovered it, she would realize that the betrayal wasn't just emotional. It threatened to destroy her future, her financial security, and everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved for nearly half her life. For several days after finding the hotel invoice, Emily said nothing. She carried on with her routine as if nothing had changed. She cooked dinner. She answered phone calls from her children. She smiled when neighbors stopped by to chat. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Inside, however, a battle was taking place. Part of her wanted to confront Michael immediately and demand answers. Another part feared what those answers might be. There's a strange kind of pain that comes from standing on the edge of the truth. You know something is wrong, but you don't yet know how wrong. And sometimes the imagination fills the empty spaces with possibilities that feel even worse than reality. Michael, meanwhile, seemed completely unaware of what Emily had discovered. He moved through the house with the same confidence he always had. He discussed future vacation plans. He talked about retirement. He joked about becoming grandparents one day. Listening to him became almost unbearable. Every conversation carried a question beneath the surface. Was any of it real? Or was she listening to a man who had become so comfortable with deception that he no longer noticed it? One evening, while Michael was in the shower, Emily sat alone in the living room holding the hotel receipt. She had looked at it dozens of times. The address, the dates, the charges, the number of guests. Every detail raised more questions. Finally, she made a decision. She would stop guessing. She would start verifying. The next morning, after Michael left for work, Emily began organizing every financial document she could find. Tax returns, bank statements, retirement reports, investment summaries, mortgage records. She spread them across the dining room table and began examining them line by line. At first, the process felt overwhelming. There were years of paperwork, thousands of transactions, endless pages of numbers. But as the hours passed, patterns began emerging. The transfers she had noticed earlier were only the beginning. Money had been moving quietly between accounts for years. Small amounts at first, amounts unlikely to attract attention, then larger sums. Some transfers occurred just days before annual tax filings. Others happened shortly before major purchases. Certain accounts seemed to exist solely to move money elsewhere. The more she reviewed, the more obvious it became that these weren't random transactions. They were deliberate, carefully timed, carefully concealed. By late afternoon, Emily had identified discrepancies totaling far more than she initially believed possible. She sat back in her chair and stared at the documents. Her heart raced. If her calculations were correct, a substantial portion of their savings was missing, not lost, moved, hidden. The realization left her feeling physically sick. For 24 years, she had trusted Michael to help secure their future. Together they had discussed retirement goals, healthcare costs, and plans for later life. She had sacrificed career opportunities believing they were building something together. Now, long enough to share financial obligations. Long enough to become part of a future Michael had never mentioned. Emily sat motionless for nearly an hour. She wasn't crying. Not yet. The shock was too deep. Her mind kept searching for another explanation. Some detail she had misunderstood. Some innocent reason why another woman's name appeared beside her husband's on official records. But every explanation collapsed under the weight of the facts. The hidden accounts, the secret transfers, the hotel stays, the unusual trips, the missing money. For the first time, everything fit together. And yet one question remained. Who was she? Emily expected the answer to be painful. She had no idea it would be devastating. Because when she finally discovered the identity of the woman connected to the property, she wouldn't just lose trust in her husband. She would lose trust in someone else she had welcomed into her life for years. Someone who had sat at her dinner table. Someone who had smiled in family photographs. Someone who had looked her in the eye while keeping one of the biggest secrets of her life. And the moment Emily uncovered that truth, the betrayal would become far worse than she ever imagined. The next morning, Emily woke after only a few hours of restless sleep. The property records were still open on her laptop, exactly where she had left them the night before. For a brief moment, she hoped she had misunderstood what she was seeing. Perhaps exhaustion had caused her to jump to conclusions. Perhaps there was another explanation waiting to be discovered. But deep down, she already knew the truth was leading somewhere she didn't want to go. The woman's name remained there on the screen, unchanged, undeniable. Emily spent the next several days searching for answers with a determination she didn't know she possessed. Every spare moment became part of an investigation. She reviewed social media accounts. She searched public records. She examined years of old photographs. She compared dates, locations, and timelines. Piece by piece, fragments of information began fitting together. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Emily was scrolling through a collection of photographs from a charity event held several years earlier when she noticed something she had overlooked before. In one image, Michael stood near a group of guests smiling for the camera. Nothing unusual about that. But standing beside him was a woman Emily recognized instantly. Her name was Rachel Turner. The realization hit her like a wave. Rachel wasn't a stranger. Rachel wasn't someone Michael had recently met during a business trip. Rachel had been part of their lives for years. Not a close friend, but close enough. She had attended neighborhood gatherings, holiday parties, charity events, community functions. Emily had spoken with her countless times, shared meals with her, laughed with her, trusted her. As the memories rushed back, Emily felt a cold heaviness settle over her. Rachel had always seemed friendly, approachable, polite. There had never been any obvious signs of tension or discomfort between them. In fact, Rachel often asked about Emily's children and seemed genuinely interested in the family's well-being. Now, every one of those conversations felt different. Every smile felt different. Every memory carried a meaning Emily had never seen before. She immediately began reviewing old photographs. Once she started looking, she noticed something startling. Rachel appeared far more frequently than she remembered. Company gatherings, fundraisers, networking events, community celebrations. Again and again, Rachel seemed to be somewhere in the background, never drawing attention, never standing too close, always present. Emily felt her stomach tighten. How long had this been happening? Months? Years? The answer arrived sooner than she expected. One of the public records connected to the property included an acquisition date. Emily checked the year, then checked it again. The property had been purchased nearly 6 years earlier. 6 years. Emily stared at the number in disbelief. 6 years of hidden transactions. 6 years of deception. 6 years of sharing a secret life. The affair she feared wasn't a recent mistake. It wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment. It appeared to be a second relationship that had existed alongside her marriage for years. And if Michael had managed to hide that for 6 years, what else had he hidden? That question haunted her. Because the more she learned, the more she realized the affair itself might only be one part of a much larger story. A few days later, Emily decided she could no longer investigate alone. She contacted a family attorney. At first, she hesitated to reveal everything. Speaking the details out loud made them feel painfully real. But once she started explaining what she had discovered, the attorney listened carefully and asked a series of questions Emily hadn't considered. Had Michael ever discouraged her from reviewing financial records? Yes. Had there been unexplained transfers? Yes. Had she uncovered undisclosed assets? Possibly. Did she have documentation? Some. The attorney remained silent for a moment before offering advice that would prove crucial in the months ahead. Gather everything. Every statement. Every record. Every piece of evidence. Do not confront him yet. Emily left the meeting feeling both terrified and validated. For months, she had questioned her own instincts. Now someone else was looking at the facts and seeing the same concerns she saw. Over the following weeks, she followed the attorney's advice carefully. She copied documents, organized timelines, saved financial records. What she discovered during that process was even more alarming. The hidden property wasn't the only undisclosed asset. There were additional accounts, additional transfers, additional investments, each one connected through a network of transactions designed to remain unnoticed. By now, Emily had stopped asking whether Michael was hiding something. The question had become how much. And then came the discovery that shattered whatever remained of her old life. It happened late one evening while reviewing years of financial records. At first, the transaction looked ordinary. A payment, then another, and another. The amounts varied, but the destination remained the same. The payments stretched back years. When Emily totaled them, her hands began trembling. The number exceeded anything she had expected. Over time, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been directed away from resources she believed belonged to their shared future. Retirement funds, savings, investments, money she thought was helping secure their lives. Instead, much of it appeared to have supported a secret existence she never knew existed. Emily pushed away from the table. The room felt impossible to breathe in. For nearly 24 years, she had trusted Michael completely. She had supported his career, raised their children, managed their home, made sacrifices she believed benefited their family. Now she was beginning to understand a painful reality. While she had been building one future, Michael had apparently been building another, and he had used their shared resources to do it. That night, Emily finally broke down. The tears came without warning. Years of trust collapsing at once. Years of memories suddenly contaminated by doubt. The grief wasn't only about losing a marriage. It was about losing certainty, losing security, losing the version of reality she thought she lived in. Yet even then, she still didn't know everything. Because hidden among the documents she had collected was evidence of one final secret. A secret that would explain why Michael had become increasingly nervous, why he had reacted so strongly when she mentioned the hidden account, and why the consequences waiting ahead would eventually extend far beyond their marriage. What Emily was about to uncover wouldn't just threaten Michael's personal life. It would threaten his professional life as well. And once that truth surfaced, the carefully controlled world he had spent years protecting would begin to fall apart faster than anyone could have imagined. For the next several days, Emily could think about little else. Every new document seemed to raise another question. Every answer uncovered a deeper layer of deception. The man she had shared a home with for nearly 24 years was beginning to feel like a stranger whose life had only occasionally intersected with her own. Yet despite everything she had discovered, one detail continued bothering her more than any other. Michael's reaction. When she had casually mentioned the hidden account weeks earlier, he hadn't appeared angry. He had appeared frightened. At the time, Emily assumed the fear came from the possibility of an affair being exposed. But now she wasn't so sure. The financial records suggested something larger was at stake. Something serious enough that even a man who had spent years keeping secrets seemed worried about it being uncovered. The answer arrived through a document Emily almost overlooked. It was buried inside a stack of records connected to one of the investment accounts. At first glance, it appeared routine. Just another financial statement among hundreds she had reviewed. But one reference caught her attention. It mentioned an entity she didn't recognize. Not a person, not a bank, a company. The name meant nothing to her. Still, curiosity pushed her to investigate further. She searched public filings, business registrations, corporate records. The more she learned, the stranger the situation became. The company appeared connected to real estate investments. Yet several of the financial transactions linked to it seemed unusually structured. Money moved in and out through multiple channels before eventually arriving at destinations connected to Michael's hidden accounts. Emily wasn't an accountant. She wasn't an attorney. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing. But she knew enough to recognize one thing. The transactions looked intentionally complicated, as if someone wanted to make them difficult to follow. The discovery immediately found its way into the growing folder she planned to share with her attorney. When they met again a few days later, the attorney reviewed the documents carefully. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for Emily to notice. He asked several questions. Had Michael ever mentioned business partnerships? No. Outside investments? No. Private ventures? No. The attorney nodded slowly. Then he said something Emily would never forget. These records deserve a closer look. That was all. No dramatic accusations. No immediate conclusions. But the seriousness in his voice told her everything she needed to know. For the first time, Emily realized that what she was uncovering might extend beyond marriage and infidelity. Months earlier, she believed she was investigating suspicious behavior. Now she was looking at a trail of financial activity she barely understood. And that trail was growing longer. The weeks that followed became a blur of meetings, document reviews, and sleepless nights. Meanwhile, Michael remained unaware of how much Emily knew. He continued behaving as though life was normal. He discussed upcoming projects. He talked about future travel plans. He even suggested planning a vacation together. Each conversation felt surreal. Emily found herself studying his face while he spoke, searching for signs of guilt, searching for signs of regret. What she found instead was confidence. The confidence of someone who believed his secrets remained secure. But secrets have a way of becoming heavier over time. The more people involved, the more money involved, the more years involved, the harder they become to carry. And Michael's burden was becoming impossible to contain. One afternoon, Emily received a phone call she wasn't expecting. The caller identified himself as someone who had previously worked with Michael. At first, the conversation seemed harmless, professional, routine. Then the caller mentioned something unusual. He assumed Emily already knew about Michael's other project. Emily remained silent. The man quickly realized his mistake. There was an awkward pause. Then he changed the subject. But the damage had already been done. Another project. Another secret. Another piece of a life Michael had never discussed. Emily ended the call with her pulse racing. Every week seemed to reveal a new layer of deception. Every layer connected to another. And the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Michael wasn't simply hiding an affair. He wasn't simply hiding money. He appeared to be living multiple versions of his life simultaneously. The husband, the businessman, the investor, the partner. Each version existed separately, each protected by carefully managed lies. Yet the walls separating those worlds were beginning to crack. The first major fracture came unexpectedly. A routine legal request related to the divorce process triggered the disclosure of additional financial records. What emerged from those records sent shockwaves through everyone involved. Several assets previously omitted from official disclosures suddenly appeared. Properties, accounts, investments. The total value stunned Emily. For years, she had worried about retirement savings, medical expenses, long-term security. Meanwhile, resources she never knew existed had been accumulating elsewhere. The discovery changed everything. It transformed the legal proceedings overnight. Questions became demands. Explanations became obligations. Documents once hidden became impossible to ignore. And for the first time, Michael appeared to realize the situation was slipping beyond his control. The confident man Emily had known for decades began showing signs of pressure. Responses arrived late. Explanations became inconsistent. Details changed. People who once seemed comfortable suddenly appeared nervous. The carefully managed story was beginning to unravel. But karma rarely arrives all at once. It often starts with small cracks, small consequences, small moments that seem insignificant until they connect together. And while Michael was focused on protecting what remained of his secrets, another problem was quietly approaching. A problem he never saw coming. Because the person who had stood beside him throughout much of this hidden life was beginning to face difficult questions of her own. Questions she couldn't easily answer. Questions that would eventually force her to make a choice. Protect Michael, or protect herself. And when that choice finally arrived, the decision she made would accelerate the collapse of everything Michael had spent years trying to keep hidden. The affair, the money, the investments, the lies. All of it was about to move into the open. And once it did, there would be no way to put it back. As the legal process intensified, something unexpected began happening behind the scenes. For years, Michael had managed to keep different parts of his life separated. The people in one world rarely interacted with the people in another. His co-workers knew one version of him. His friends knew another. Emily knew the version he wanted her to see. Rachel knew a different version entirely. That separation had protected him for a long time. But now lawyers were asking questions, financial records were being reviewed, and timelines were being compared. The walls he had spent years building were starting to collapse into one another. Emily noticed the shift almost immediately. People who had once been confident suddenly became cautious. Conversations ended abruptly when certain topics were mentioned. Explanations that once sounded polished now seemed rushed. For the first time since discovering the hidden account, Emily felt something changing. The truth was no longer moving toward her. It was moving toward everyone else. One afternoon, her attorney called with an update. Additional records had been obtained. Nothing dramatic in appearance, just paperwork. But paperwork has a way of telling stories people don't intend to tell. The new documents revealed a timeline that stretched back even further than Emily expected. The property connected to Rachel wasn't the beginning. It was only one piece of a much larger picture. Financial transfers connected to Michael and Rachel appeared years before the property purchase. Certain transactions matched dates when Michael claimed to be traveling for work. Others aligned with periods where large amounts of money quietly disappeared from accounts Emily believed were dedicated to their family's future. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. This wasn't something that happened impulsively. It wasn't a brief mistake. It had been organized, maintained, protected, year after year. The realization hit Emily harder than any single document ever could. Because affairs often involve deception. But maintaining a hidden life for years requires planning. Every anniversary celebrated, every holiday shared, every promise made, all while knowing the truth remained hidden. That understanding hurt more than the financial losses, more than the legal battles, more than the humiliation. It forced Emily to confront a painful question. How many moments she treasured had been genuine, and how many had simply been performances? The answer became even more painful a few weeks later. Rachel began cooperating. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly. According to information that eventually surfaced during legal proceedings, Rachel had become increasingly concerned about protecting her own future. What started as a hidden relationship had evolved into something complicated and unstable. Promises had been made. Expectations had been created. Financial arrangements had been established, and now everything was under scrutiny. For years, Michael had successfully balanced both worlds. Now he was struggling to control either one. As pressure increased, disagreements emerged. The same secrecy that once protected everyone involved was becoming a liability. People started looking out for themselves. Documents appeared. Records surfaced. Details that had remained hidden for years suddenly became accessible. Each revelation pushed Michael further into a corner. Emily watched it happen with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. There was a time when she would have done anything to protect him. Now she found herself observing a man desperately trying to hold together a story that was falling apart piece by piece. The most surprising part was how quickly circumstances changed once the truth started emerging. For years, Michael had seemed untouchable, successful, respected, in control. Then, almost gradually, that image began fading. Professional relationships became strained. Questions emerged that couldn't be ignored. People who once admired him started seeing him differently. The reputation he spent decades building began carrying an asterisk beside it. Not because of rumors, because of facts. Facts documented on paper. Facts supported by records. Facts that refused to disappear. Yet even then, Emily wasn't celebrating. Many people assumed that exposing a betrayal immediately feels satisfying. The reality was different. The truth brought relief, but it also brought grief. Because every revelation confirmed something she wished wasn't true. Every document proved another lie. Every answer erased another piece of the life she thought she had. There were nights she sat alone in her house, surrounded by silence, wondering how everything had changed so completely. The home felt different now. The photographs felt different. The memories felt different. She wasn't grieving a marriage anymore. She was grieving a future she had expected to have. And grief doesn't disappear simply because you're right. Meanwhile, karma continued moving in ways nobody anticipated. The relationship Michael had protected for so many years began experiencing the same problems that had damaged everything else. Trust. Ironically, trust became the issue. Once secrets start coming into the light, people begin asking questions. And when relationships are built on hidden foundations, those questions can become difficult to answer. Tension increased. Disagreements followed. Promises made years earlier became sources of conflict. The future Michael thought he was building no longer looked secure. The life he risked everything to protect was beginning to crack beneath him. Emily learned about much of this indirectly. Through legal filings. Through mutual acquaintances. Through information that surfaced during the proceedings. She rarely sought it out. By then, her focus had started shifting elsewhere. Something inside her was changing. For months, she had been consumed by discovery, consumed by evidence, consumed by trying to understand what happened. Eventually, she became exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. She realized that if she spent the rest of her life studying Michael's choices, she would never have time to rebuild her own. That realization became a turning point. A quiet one, but a powerful one. For the first time since the betrayal came to light, Emily stopped asking what Michael was doing. Instead, she started asking what she wanted. The question felt unfamiliar. For decades, many of her decisions had centered around family responsibilities, marriage obligations, and supporting other people's goals. Now she was being forced to imagine a future that belonged entirely to her. At first, that idea felt terrifying. Then it began feeling liberating. Slowly, almost without noticing it, Emily started rebuilding. She reconnected with old friends. She traveled to places she had postponed visiting. She explored interests she had ignored for years. She even considered opportunities she once dismissed because they didn't fit into the life she thought she would always have. The changes weren't dramatic. They happened one step at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time. But those small steps were leading somewhere important. Because while Michael's world continued shrinking under the weight of years of deception, Emily's world was beginning to expand in ways she never expected. And the most remarkable part was that she wasn't healing because justice was unfolding. She was healing because she was finally discovering who she could become without carrying the burden of someone else's lies. Still, one final chapter remained. One final moment neither Emily nor Michael could have predicted. A moment years later that would bring them face to face again. A moment that would reveal how completely their lives had changed. And a moment that would prove that the greatest form of karma isn't always watching someone fall. Sometimes it's realizing you've risen so far beyond the pain that their choices no longer have the power to hurt you. The years that followed unfolded very differently for Emily and Michael. For a long time, Emily had imagined that healing would arrive all at once. She thought there would be a moment when the pain disappeared, when the anger faded, and when the memories stopped hurting. Instead, recovery came slowly. It arrived in ordinary moments she almost failed to notice. It appeared during quiet mornings when she woke up without immediately thinking about the betrayal. It appeared during dinners with friends when she found herself laughing without forcing it. It appeared during trips she had postponed for years because life had always seemed too busy. Most importantly, it appeared when she stopped measuring her future against the life she had lost. At first, rebuilding felt impossible. Then it felt difficult. Then it simply became her new reality. The woman who had once spent nights staring at financial records and wondering how everything had fallen apart gradually transformed into someone stronger than she ever expected to become. She pursued interests she had ignored for decades. She expanded her social circle. She volunteered. She traveled. She discovered that there was an entire version of herself waiting on the other side of heartbreak. What surprised her most was that happiness returned before she expected it. Not the happiness of pretending nothing happened. Not the happiness of getting revenge. A deeper kind of happiness. The kind that comes from surviving something you thought would destroy you. Meanwhile, Michael's life was moving in the opposite direction. The consequences that had begun during the legal proceedings continued long after the paperwork was finalized. Professional opportunities became harder to find. Relationships that once seemed secure became strained. The trust he had spent decades building was difficult to restore once people understood the full story. The hidden life that had seemed worth protecting for so many years carried a cost he never fully anticipated. Some friendships disappeared. Some professional connections quietly faded away. Some doors that had once opened easily remained closed. The image he spent years creating had been damaged, and rebuilding it proved far more difficult than maintaining it ever was. Then there was Rachel. The relationship that had once appeared exciting and full of possibility eventually faced the same reality that affects many relationships built on secrecy. Once the hidden world became public, everyday life replaced fantasy. The excitement disappeared. The pressure increased. Expectations changed. Over time, the relationship that had once seemed so important began to fracture under the weight of everything surrounding it. The future Michael thought he was creating never materialized the way he imagined. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In trying to protect two lives at once, he eventually damaged both. But the most remarkable chapter of the story wasn't about Michael's struggles. It was about Emily's freedom. Several years after the divorce, Emily attended a fundraising event in downtown Chicago. By then, her life looked completely different. She had built new friendships, developed new routines, created new goals. The betrayal that once dominated every thought had become something she rarely discussed. It remained part of her story, but it was no longer the center of it. That evening, as guests mingled throughout the venue, Emily noticed a familiar face standing across the room. Michael. For a brief moment, time seemed to pause. Not because she still loved him, not because she hated him, because seeing him reminded her of how much life had changed. The man standing there looked older than she remembered. Not simply older in years, older in spirit. Life had left its marks. The confidence she once associated with him seemed quieter now, more restrained. Their eyes met. A few moments later, Michael slowly approached. Neither knew exactly what to say. Years of history stood between them. Years of memories. Years of pain. Years of growth. Eventually, Michael broke the silence. He asked how she had been. Emily smiled politely. They exchanged a few brief words. Then something unexpected happened. Michael apologized. Not the kind of apology people offer to end an uncomfortable conversation. A real apology. He acknowledged the pain, the deception, the damage. He admitted that many of the choices he made had consequences he never fully understood until much later. Emily listened quietly. Years earlier, she had imagined this moment countless times. She imagined confronting him, demanding answers, demanding accountability, demanding justice. Yet standing there now, she felt something completely different. Nothing. Not anger. Not bitterness. Not satisfaction. Peace. Because somewhere along the way, she had stopped needing anything from him. The apology wasn't unwelcome, but it wasn't necessary. The healing had already happened. Michael's words couldn't give it to her because she had already found it herself. As their conversation ended, Emily wished him well and walked away. And in that moment, she realized something profound. The greatest form of karma wasn't watching Michael face consequences. It wasn't seeing relationships fail. It wasn't seeing reputations damaged. It wasn't seeing years of deception exposed. The greatest form of karma was becoming someone the betrayal could no longer control. For years, Emily believed Michael had taken everything from her. Her trust, her security, her future. But standing there, years later, she understood the truth. He hadn't taken her future. He had only changed its direction. And unexpectedly, that new direction led somewhere better than she ever imagined. Looking back, Emily eventually came to understand that karma doesn't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. Sometimes it arrives as growth. Sometimes it arrives as freedom. The betrayal that once broke her forced her to discover strengths she never knew she possessed. It pushed her toward opportunities she would never have pursued. It introduced her to people she otherwise never would have met. It taught her that resilience isn't something you're born with. It's something you discover when life gives you no other choice. Many people spend years waiting for karma to punish those who hurt them. Emily learned a different lesson. The most powerful victory isn't watching someone else lose. It's rebuilding your own life so completely that the people who once wounded you become chapters instead of destinations. And perhaps that's the real question this story leaves behind. If someone betrayed your trust after decades together, would you spend your life hoping karma finds them? Or would you focus on creating a life so fulfilling that their betrayal becomes the very thing that led you toward a better future? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that ultimately made you stronger? We'd love to hear your story. And if this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next powerful true story. Because sometimes the worst chapter of your life becomes the beginning of the best one.